welcome to this edition of I-24 News Defense, a look at the latest in strategic affairs, security, intel, and more. In this edition, we go back to some of the biggest defense and security issues of 2014 and look ahead to how those threats are set to develop and what the global picture will look like in 2015. As the year draws to a close, several regional threats emerged as the most significant of 2014. Danielle Ziri has a look back at two of those, the rise of the Islamic State terror group and the summer war between Israel and Hamas.
2014, a year marked by a surge in security threats all over the world. Radical groups have been on the rise throughout the year, but perhaps the most significant of all was the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which later became known as the Islamic State Group, a name that people all over the world have come to know. Counterterrorism experts consider it to be the wealthiest terrorist organization in the world. The Islamic State manages to fund itself independently by taking control of oil fields. Different countries such as Turkey, Iran, and Syria then purchase this resource from them. On September 10, 2014, U.S. President Barack Obama laid out his strategy for destroying this terrorist group.
We will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists.
U.S. airstrikes began a few days later and are still ongoing. In Israel, summer 2014 was marked by 50 days of war. Israel launched Operation Protective Edge in Gaza in order to stop Hamas's rocket fire into the country. Israeli officials set a clear goal: crush Hamas's infrastructure and destroy its ability to attack Israeli cities. This latest operation surely raised questions regarding the best ways for Israel to deal with the threats it faces from Hamas in the south, but also from the Hezbollah and the Islamic jihadists in the north.
And joining me now in the studio is Alon Ben David, Senior Defense Analyst at Israel's Channel 10 News. Good evening. Thanks very much for being with me. And Rachel Kantz-Feder, researcher at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle East Studies and an expert in political Islam. Let's begin with the Islamic State. We've discussed here very often the specific strategy, the situation in Syria and Iraq as it stands the day of. I want to take this opportunity to sort of zoom out and look at the year as a whole. Was the Islamic State truly the surprise that it seems it was? Was it a surprise to intelligence agencies, to Mideast experts, or is that only an impression?
The surprise is in two areas. One is their aesthetic notion. The fact that they know how to brand themselves, how to sell themselves in the media, and especially in the social media, and then they do it brilliantly, and that's why they mobilize so many young people around the world. The other thing is that what we see here is more than a terror organization. It's an idea, it's an organization, but it's also a functioning state. They actually govern those areas that they control. They actually manage the life of the people, and there, this phenomenon is new. There is something new that we see and that we have not, I think, predicted before.
I want to get into the specific spread and their tactics in a moment, but Rachel, is that the case for you at the Moshe Dayan Center, for example? Did this catch experts off guard?
Of course, I think it was not until June 10th that the world really woke up to the threat of the Islamic State, and that was, of course, with their seizure of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, the subsequent declaration of a caliphate and the public beheadings and other atrocities. Within expert communities, we have been studying their rise, but I do think that even the audaciousness, the scope, and the speed with which they executed their assaults wasn't entirely anticipated by closer observers either.
I tend to have heard sort of two major perspectives. One, that if the coalition was determined enough, strong enough, organized enough, this group could be wiped out in a year. And on the other end of the spectrum, that they are very advanced, that they have a lot of social kind of very advanced social media tactics and so on, and that that's not the case at all. Which one do you subscribe to?
You're right. There are those. I do have colleagues that are actually not all that impressed by ISIS's achievements. They think this is a fleeting phenomenon and that actually the world response is just fueling their self-aggrandizing efforts by their powerful social media apparatus. On the other hand, you do have the argument that, and you do have those who have already recited the eulogies for the states of Iraq and Syria. They're writing those for Lebanon and Jordan, and that we're really looking at the total collapse of the state system. I'm not convinced we're there yet. I do think it's premature, and that even with certain restructuring of polities as we know them in the region and border changes, that the magnitude of the threat posed by ISIS isn't is a little bit inflated by some.
So in the short time we have left, looking at the tactics for a moment, clearly their social media skills, these very well-produced, graphic-filled videos and magazines. What makes it different? What makes IS different than the Taliban or Al-Qaeda before them? What makes them so attractive to foreign fighters?
I think that the way that they project themselves into the social media and the way that they mobilize people, their appeal, their aesthetic notion, the fact that they are reconstructing a Hollywood scene in almost all of their films, that makes them so attractive, and they recognize exactly where are the places to market themselves. They don't work with CNN, they don't work with BBC. They would allow access to Vice.com because they understand that most of the viewership of Vice.com,
their audience is.
Their audience is young men, young bored men who might be the potential inventory for recruits. So they know exactly how to market themselves. They should be awarded a 2014 branding award, because I think they're as great as Coca-Cola.
I've
after
perhaps heard it best described by one analyst who called it five-star jihad versus all others. Alon, thanks very much for this. You'll be staying with us. Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we shift gears now to our backyard here in the Jaffa Port and to the summer war between Israel and Hamas. Before we discuss, let's take a look back.
Hamas and other terrorist groups in Gaza are firing rockets on cities throughout the state of Israel.
حركة حماس غير مكترثين بقرارات الكابينة الإسرائيلي.
أن أعلن موافقة القيادة الفلسطينية على دعوة مصر الشقيقة لوقف إطلاق النار الشامل والدائم ابتداء من الساعة 7.
Why is it that today Hamas accepted the very same Egyptian framework that it rejected a month ago? Ultimately, so much bloodshed could have been avoided.
51 يوم جعل كلمة القسام وكلمة المقاومة هي العليا.
Still with me on set is Alon Ben-David, senior defense correspondent for Channel 10 News. Alon, you've covered this obviously extensively, this war and all of those before. 4 months later, Gaza is still in ruins. The Israeli government is in disarray. Hamas is testing new missiles in the sea. Did both sides come out as the big losers in this case?
No one won, if that's what you're asking. I don't know who's a bigger loser. I think Hamas is right now, and I have to tell you that in the short perspective that we have, only 4 months, I find encouragement in the way that I see Hamas behaving since the end of the war, because I know that most Israelis have ended this war with a sense of sourness. But if you look at Hamas behavior, and look at last week, for example, Hamas has lost a senior operative last week when the IDF responded for a sniper fire coming out of Gaza. They never absorbed such a hit without retaliation, and this time they chose not to. They had done nothing, despite the fact that they've lost a senior officer.
They have lost a lot of friends diplomatically, though, as well, in the last couple of months.
Well, everything is changing. I see an encouragement also in the fact that Qatar is coming back to the embrace of the moderate Sunni countries, coming closer to Egypt, and might cooperate with Egypt in the reconstruction of the Strip. And looking at the 3 incidents in which rocket fire came out of Gaza to Israel, and the way that Hamas have went out of their way to make it clear to Israel that A, it wasn't them, and B, that they've arrested the people who did that, and they did. That's a good sign for me. It's not that Hamas are going to support the Zionist idea, but it seems to me that they've lost the appetite for renewed conflict, at least, I'd say, in the coming year. So I think we can look at the Gaza operation and carefully say that there is room for hope that southern Israel would enjoy some time of calm. I don't know how long.
On the Israeli side, there was a lot of criticism during the war and certainly after about preparedness, that the IDF was not fully aware of the degree of the tunnel threat, which of course emerged as the major issue of the last war. 4 months later, with a bit more perspective, was that the case? Was Israel caught unprepared?
There are 2 issues here. One, the IDF did know about the tunnels, but was not aware. They had the problem of interpreting the intelligence that they had before them, human error that happened before and will happen again. At the end of the day, when they realized that became the objective of the operation. And the fact is that the whole war was fought on Hamas courtyard. They've drawn the IDF to the underground fighting where the IDF has no advantage.
Was that an IDF mistake to have ended up being drawn into such a conflict?
I think that the IDF didn't exercise any of its advantages, which are the fast, heavy, protected maneuver with lots of firepower. The maneuver was very shallow, about a mile, less than a mile into the strip. So we didn't brought into effect all the advantages of the armor of the IDF. We were drawn to fight against Hamas in their own tunnels, and yes, we paid a price for that. I believe that the IDF has learned something out of that, and first of all, they will become better in fighting underground warfare, and second, next time I think we will see a more swift, determined maneuver by the IDF and not such a shallow one.
What is clear, if anything, in what you say, and as what we always hear, is next time, that at least the next round is inevitable in some way. We'll see in which one. Alon Ben David, thank you very much.
Unfortunately, thank you.
We'll see you back here often. Shifting gears now, over the course of the year in eastern Ukraine, a battle over identity turned into a fierce battle on the ground, with the Russian separatists fighting Ukrainian forces for control and international pressure and sanctions mounting over Russia's involvement. Here's a look back at the year Ukraine's central bank has called the worst since World War II.
The crisis in Ukraine broke out early in 2014 and led to the overthrow of the pro-Russian government. This in turn caused Russia to annex Crimea and escalate the fighting in eastern Ukraine between the central government in Kiev and pro-Russian separatists. The conflict has reignited old Cold War rivalries between Russia and the West, with profound implications for international relations as well as for global economy. The root of today's conflict began with protests in Kiev against President Viktor Yanukovych after in November 2013 he terminated negotiations for further cooperation with the EU. Early in 2014, the protests escalated into clashes between security forces and demonstrators with dozens of casualties. Yanukovych declared new elections and restoration of the 2004 constitution, but the demonstrations continued. Parliament ousted Yanukovych, who went underground and later fled the country. Russia, trying to salvage its influence in Ukraine, invaded and annexed Crimea in March 2014. The next month, pro-Russian separatist rebels began seizing territory in eastern Ukraine. The rebels allegedly shot down Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 on July 17, killing 298 people. Fighting between rebels and the Ukrainian military intensified, and in August, Moscow was accused of sending troops and weapons over the border into eastern Ukraine. In the months of fighting, nearly 5,000 people have been killed, while more than 500,000 have been displaced and are seeking asylum. This has all brought the relationship between Russia and the West into its lowest point since the Cold War. Sanctions and the falling prices of oil are pushing the Russian economy to the brink of recession, and while various attempts to resolve the situation are underway, the crisis and its wider impact will follow us into 2015.
And joining me now is Paula Slier, Middle East Bureau Chief for Russia Today, who of course has spent much time this year in eastern Ukraine covering this conflict. As I mentioned before, the central bank has called this the worst since World War II, the worst year for Ukraine. Where does the situation in eastern Ukraine stand now between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists?
It's almost at a stalemate. I was there about a month ago, and when you're in eastern Ukraine, they have declared themselves independent states. They had elections, they've elected their own leaders. None of that is recognized by Kiev, and there was Minsk discussions, Minsk talks, and I was there when those talks were happening, but it was almost as if you had two different interpretations of what was actually agreed at those talks. And what people in eastern Ukraine were saying they understood were the conclusions of those attempted peace talks is very different to what is coming out of Kiev. You do have a ceasefire in place. There are some calling for perhaps the United Nations to get more involved in actually making sure that that ceasefire is implemented. Again, when I was there, although the ceasefire was in place, you still had occasional shelling, you still had reports of violence, both sides accusing the other of actually violating the ceasefire.
I want to take this point of these two totally different perspectives of the same situation, as you mentioned, and so much international pressure still in the annexation of Crimea, but when you have the reality of a population, in this case in parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, that identifies as Russian, is that sustainable for Ukraine?
Well, certainly for the Russians, it's sustainable. And that's been Moscow's argument all along, is that people here are ethnically Russian. The initiative came from them, both in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, to be part of Russia, although Crimea is annexed and eastern Ukraine at this stage is not, and no indication from Moscow that it will be. But in terms of Kiev, you can understand their argument as well. They feel that here you have a sovereign country, you have a group that's trying to break away, and the message that has constantly come out of the Kiev government has been, let's try and talk this through. But the anger in eastern Ukraine is that they say that Kiev is not sincere about those efforts. They don't trust the Kiev government. And again, you have these two very different rhetorics where neither side actually trusts the other. The reality on the ground is very worrying. You have winter approaching right now. You have people in eastern Ukraine. I have done many reports on pensioners, for example, who often are the most vulnerable of the society, where people are literally starving. I've spoken to people who are not getting their pension money and haven't for weeks. They don't know where the next meal is going to come from. So on one level, you have this political stalemate. And then on the other level, you have people who, yes, don't want to be part of Kiev, want to be more closely associated with Russia, but are feeling the brunt of sanctions that are being imposed on them by the Kiev government.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. It'll be interesting to see where Putin goes in 2015. Paula Sleer, thanks very much for this. And that's it for us for tonight. Join us back here next week in 2015 for another edition of I-24 News Defense.